Welcome to Mother's Narrative Network. Before we begin, please like and subscribe for more daily uploads. Hope you enjoy today's video. Ghost stories. Someone mentioned on another thread that it would be good to start a ghost story thread. So I thought I'd give it a go. Have you ever seen a ghost or a mysterious person? I've never seen one, but my mum says that she has seen an old woman in her room, dressed in old clothes. After a few minutes, she just vanished. Haven't seen one, but in a hotel we were in, had a girl running up and down above us and screaming in the middle of the night. Realized in the morning that we were on the top floor and there was no loft. Whether this was a dream or not I couldn't tell you, and I can't ask my mum and dad as they are both passed. I remember at about 6 years old getting into my parents' bed in the middle of the night and getting in between them. Anyway, when I woke up my mum wasn't there, it was just my dad. I happened to turn around and saw another one of my dad, and I said, "Daddy, there's a man in the bed with the same face as you." My dad replied in flat, somber and almost resigned voice, "Oh, ignore him, he'll go away in a minute." I then remember my mum, who was very we would often say, "Do you remember when you saw another one of your dad?" However, I'm inclined to think that part was definitely a false memory, because my mum would not have wanted another mention of something so creepy. Plus, if I had have told her there was another one of my dad in the house, she would have left the country. I don't know about town. Our house is 100+ years old. Had a few freaky encounters, but this was the worst. It was Christmas night, the early hours of Boxing Day 2020, just after midnight. I was alone downstairs watching a bit of telly, my husband, my 13-month-old daughter and 6-year-old son all upstairs in their beds. I eventually decided to go up myself. As you walk up our stairs, my daughter's room is immediately at the top on the right. As I made my way up, I could distinctly hear my husband in her room, shushing her back to sleep. She'd recently had her MMR jab, and had been sleeping terribly. My husband had a brilliant knack of whispering sh, shhhhhh over and over while rubbing her back. I crept past her room feeling terrible that she'd woken, and I hadn't heard her, and not wanting to undo his good work by disturbing her. As I opened our bedroom door, I was surprised to find my husband snoring away in a deep sleep in our bed. I went into her room, the shushing sound stopped, I checked on her and she too was sound asleep. Way too creepy, and not the first time I'd heard auditory phenomena I couldn't explain. For the record, I hadn't been drinking, because I was still BF at this time. Following night, my son starts screaming in the early hours. Not unusual, as he would sometimes still wet the bed. I go into him and he says, "Mom, you woke me up and you left before I'd got back to sleep." That was you, wasn't it? The black figure by my bed. So I reassured him that I'd been in to make sure his duvet was straight, and I sat next to him while he fell asleep. Except I hadn't been into him at all. Next morning I was full of rage that things that only I had previously heard were potentially starting to affect the children. I do appreciate he could have had a bad dream, but off the back of the night before it freaked me out. The house, many years ago, 1940s, used to belong to a primary school teacher, who apparently loved children, according to an elderly neighbor, so it may well have been well-meaning. However, while my husband was out with the children, I went into both bedrooms and shouted to whoever it might have been, "Thanks, but no thanks," and later bought a couple of protection crystals to place outside their bedrooms out of desperation. I've heard other things in the house since, but thankfully the children haven't. Oh, I forgot about the one in our house. Ours is over 100 years old too, and one night soon after we moved in we were in bed and I just had this cold feeling of dread come over me, and I just knew someone from a previous time was in the house, which makes no sense, because I'm not big on woo stuff, but I just knew. Then in the middle of the night I woke up to my husband freaking out, because he'd seen a man looming over him. Was so freaky. We actually did similar, and prayed the man away, and he hasn't been back since. We did find some of his belongings from WW1 in the loft though. The first thing that popped into my mind I decided not to post, then I read the comments in the thread so far and now I have to, because it's another duplicate dad one, and now I'm wondering if it's a thing. I was primary school age, and had woken up in the middle of the night, and couldn't get back to sleep as I was feeling really weird. These days I'd call it uneasy, but back then I just remember I feel weird. After laying awake a while, I heard my dad say Ajax. Ajax? I replied, yes. Come on, it's time for school, outside my bedroom door. The voice was my dad's and was specifically coming from the left of my bedroom door towards kitchen, bungalow. It wasn't a whisper, it was his normal speaking voice, maybe a bit louder than. I was very confused, as it absolutely wasn't time for school. I didn't reply again, being very confused, and didn't move a muscle for a while because it was too strange. Eventually got out of bed, looked out my bedroom door, no dad to be seen. Went to parents' bedroom, to the right, end of the hallway, opened door and peeked in, dad was sound asleep. I remember wondering if he had sleepwalked, but he wasn't a sleepwalker ever, doubt he would have had time to get back to his bedroom and lay down before I saw him, and I absolutely would have heard him walking down the hallway, and into his bedroom especially as the door was closed anyway. Dead weird and still can't explain it. I assume if I have answered the call I'd have been spirited away by Ghost Dad. There is a phenomena about this. It says that bad spirits will pretend to be people that you know, and they will imitate their voice. You see loads of stories online of people saying that they heard their girlfriend call them, but they knew that their girlfriend wasn't in the house. At primary school, one of my friends would often tell us stories about the ghost in her house. How one day her family arrived home to hear water running in the bath. Went upstairs to find both taps on. They turned the taps off, but not long after they arrived home to hear water, and this time the taps themselves were gone. Wet handprints would appear on the wall. Stuff was always disappearing or being moved about. She was an intelligent, shy, quiet girl and not given to boasting or making things up, so her stories definitely chilled us. I only went to her home once and the hallway and stairs were crammed with vintage clocks. Her dad collected them and they were all ticking and chiming away. I asked to use the loo and was directed to the bathroom upstairs. Halfway up the stairs the air turned icy cold and I suddenly felt scared stiff. Used the loo as quickly as I could and raced back to the living room. I never went back, but I always believed her tales after that. I stayed at the Red Lion in Colchester with my then 2-year-old. It's apparently one of the most haunted hotels in the UK, and the room we were in was certainly atmospheric, very old with beams, and it even had part of the ancient wall made with straw and mud behind a pane of glass. Anyway, the night passed without incident, although I did hear my boy stir and mumble a few times from the travel cot. When he woke for the morning he stood up, pointed at the chair next to the cot and said, "Oh. Lady gone. The dad thing. You guys keep reminding me of things. Am I just a magnet for this stuff?" When I was younger my dad came into my room and stood over me in the middle of the night. Because I was a kid I thought he was just checking on me, so I mumbled at him and then went to sleep. In the morning I asked him about it, and he said he didn't come in. Also from that night onwards my favorite toy had disappeared off the face of the earth, which is very weird. Oh, I remember something scary that happened to me. I was 16, and I was staying in a friend's house. They lived really far out in the country. It was a really big, really old house. I was sleeping on the couch downstairs. Everyone else was upstairs. I woke up in the middle of the night, with a really weird feeling. I sat up. Behind the couch was a really big window. It was huge. So I was sitting, facing into the room. I looked at my watch. It was 3 a.m. Just when I sat up, right behind where my head was, there was a knock on the window. 3 loud knocks. I was so scared. I turned the light on and sat in a different chair until morning. Next morning I asked if any of them had gotten up in the middle of the night. None of them had. My first house. As soon as I viewed it, my blood ran cold and I had such an uneasy feeling, especially on the upstairs landing. The house was otherwise perfect and a renovation project, so I put it down to just needing some work done. Except I renovated it top to bottom and the feeling didn't go away. It was just me and my daughter living in the house. It was beautifully done, but I would feel the most awful sense of dread come over me as soon as I stepped into the house. People would feel like they were being watched, and then I started to see shadows of figures upstairs. I can't really describe how the house felt, but once the figures started to become more prominent, we moved. I downsized and moved into another house that needed work, just so I could move ASAP. That house felt so light and freeing from the second I walked into it that I knew it was the right choice to move. Living abroad, I moved into an older apartment. It has 2 floors. Floorboards in the whole apartment are creaky, so when someone walks it is very loud. On many occasions, I have heard footsteps clear as day walking across the floor above me. Absolutely undeniably in the bedroom above. We are on the top floor, so there's no chance it's coming from a different apartment, and it's very clearly overhead. I'm not the only person who has witnessed it. It happened when I first viewed the apartment and the estate agent, DP, and I all acknowledged it. My friend has heard it in the middle of the night, when we were sat on the sofa chatting away, came to stay for the first time in a long time, and we were sat up chatting. She literally looked terrified and grabbed my arm, and was so surprised. She said she'd never experienced anything like that so clearly before. The bathroom door has this weird, frosted glass panel in it. They are common here. I've seen, clear as day, someone moving in the bathroom. I nearly had a nervous breakdown, as it was so clear, and looked like someone dressed in black passing the window. I flung open the door and of course, nobody there. The weird thing is, this apartment has the warmest, safest, and most welcoming feel to it. I've never felt anything like it. As soon as I entered the apartment to view it, I could feel this wonderful, warm presence. Like I knew that the previous owner was still here, and I knew that they were not a threat, but a positive presence. I know that sounds absolutely mad. My children have said, by themselves, things that indicate that they feel similar. I've not discussed it with them, because I didn't want to scare them, but they've brought it up on their own. We all feel that the apartment has the vibe of an elderly, kindly man and woman who lived here before and isn't ready to move on yet. Weirdly, we don't want them to leave and find their presence comforting. My friend suggested saging the apartment, but I don't want to, in case it works and I make this kindly presence leave before they are ready to. Poltergeist activity in every house I've lived in. Siblings saw a man, but I only had noises and things flying across my path. One thing hit me very hard in the face. Current house, I hear someone walking in circles in my youngest child's room. Nowhere else. When I'm alone. I had to leave DS11 at home other day for about 10 minutes, and he said he was scared. Footsteps above him. Things in my house always disappear, never to be seen again. Keys, pictures DC have drawn, toys. There is no logical explanation for it. Oh, one time, I was in an office by myself. Something grabbed the back of my chair on wheels and pulled me across the room. My mum lives in an old house alone. She tells me that she often sees people around that just disappear. She sees something every couple of weeks. An old woman, an old man, a young woman. She's old but she's very mentally sharp, so it's not the onside of dementia or anything. I've stayed there and I've never seen anything. I wonder if older people are better able to see spirits. I read before somewhere that young children and older people are better able to see spirits, as they are nearer to the spiritual realm in age. While people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s are more rooted in the physical world. I've had a few experiences I can't explain, all in my childhood home, which was modern on a nice and very standard housing estate. First, I was reading in bed as a teen and the lamp went out. I shared a room with my sister. She was there too. We'd discussed a weird vibe, so with false confidence, I shouted at the ghost to turn the light back on. It did so instantly. Another time, same room, I woke in the night and was definitely tucked into bed, duvet tucked in the length of body, both sides, and then the weight of the person sat on the bed next to me. I told Mum in the morning and she just matter of fact said, "Oh, that'll be your great nan, she does that to me too." In hospital having my eldest, I fell asleep sat in bed, holding the baby, and a voice clearly shouted, "NC," and woke me with a start. There was no one there, but I popped baby in his cot and went back to sleep. I'm trying to think back. I'm sure I've had a couple of other mysterious experiences. Oh, I can think of another nice one. I was lying in my bed when I heard my dad's voice, clear as day, say, "There's my lovely daughter." He had passed away 5 years ago. I recently viewed a house with my sister. It was a 4-bedroom very old cottage. House felt fine except when I walked into one of the bedrooms. I will mention here I have form for picking up on spirits. I did in this case, strongly. It was a male presence linked to that bedroom and it felt dreadfully sad. I told my sister as soon as we left the house. After the viewing, my sister inquired with the estate agent as to why vendor was selling house. After just 2 years of owning, an estate agent admitted that he wanted to get away from the memories that son had died in the house. Suffice to say, she didn't buy it. I was about 9 or 10, and I heard a scratching on my bedroom window. It woke me up. Ad went on and on. Eventually I built up my nerve and opened the curtain. It was the cat. She'd been locked out. My bedroom was over the dining room that had a bay window. Love a woo thread. Lived in an old spooky house as a student. Formerly owned by undertakers. A friend stayed over in lounge, and said she had most dreadful night sleep, felt like someone was touching her and whispering to her all night. Said friend was a science student and most woo person you could meet. Never liked being in house on my own, and my 5 other housemates all used to cram into my room to talk, as it was the least eerie room. It was an extension and wasn't part of the original house. Definitely was an atmosphere in that house. In my early 30s, I had this freaky, realistic dream, where someone told me that I had to tell my granddad that his sister had died. It was so real, but very odd, as my granddad had been estranged from his sister for over 50 years, as he didn't like her, and I'd never met the woman. Didn't think anything of it until 3 days later I was chatting to my mum on the phone, and at the end of the call she said, "Oh, by the way, your great-aunt died 3 days ago, not that you knew her." It was all very odd. My friend's mum passed away young, when my friend was still a teenager living at home. The night she died, the landline in their house rang. My friend answered it and said he could hear an open line, but nobody spoke, so he hung up. He dialed 1471, and the number was his own landline. I am a skeptic, but I've also had things happen to me that I can't explain. Do enjoy a spooky story though. I don't believe I ghosts, but I've had a couple of experiences that I put down to my mind playing tricks on me. Others may disagree though, so I'll post them here for fun. The first was when I was about 13, staying over a friend's house. She had a beanbag across from her bed that had a teddy sat on it. I woke up in the night to see a boy of about 8 sitting on the beanbag, looking back at me. He had blonde hair and was wearing a green t-shirt and jeans. We locked eyes and then I watched as he slowly disappeared and I could see the teddy again. Only when he was gone did I get frightened and hid under the covers and went back to sleep. The second was when I was a little older, maybe 15, walking down the stairs at home and was shoved from behind. I grabbed the railing to keep from falling and assuming it had been my brother, span round to shout at him about how bloody dangerous that was, and no one was there. That one is a little more tricky to explain, but I think it was my mind misinterpreting some kind of nerve spasm, or something along those lines. It seems more likely than being shoved by a ghost. A few years ago, I was worrying about something, so much so that it was affecting my sleep. One night, I was lying awake and I suddenly felt as though I was being hugged, although nothing was touching me. It's hard to explain, like a feeling of comfort covered me and I felt warm and a sense of relief. Then a man's voice said, "You'll be all right." I know it wasn't spoken aloud, it was more like telepathy. Only I could have heard it. My brother, who is a devout Christian, says it was God. I am open to any ideas, I just know that it definitely happened. This was around 10 years ago. My husband and kids had gone to a local weaving shed museum. Our town was rife with cotton mills in the early 1900s. We were in the weaving shed with all 300 machines on and it was deafening. At the end of the demo we were walking out of that area, and I was the last person to leave the room. As I turned around to walk out, I felt a finger prod me quite hard in the shoulder. There is no way I imagined it. We lived a few hundred meters away in a house on a terrace row that would have been built for the workers, and every now and then around 4 in the morning you would hear someone slowly walking up the street in heavy footwear. Stop, then knock, a tap, then walk and tap again. Maybe a ghostly knock-upper. 40 years ago, I lived in a house share with 2 other young people, who I will call Joanna and Freddie, outside a village southwest of Newbury. We felt lucky. It was a beautifully converted lodge house, at the foot of a wooded hill on the way to a fishing lake. It was one of those houses historically sold off by the local estate to pay death duties. The new young owners had moved abroad to work for a few years, and we were 6 months into a 2-year let. We all got on together and the lodge was very comfortable. We sat out in the garden that first summer listening to the birds in the treetops, watching the squirrels and the rabbits on the nearby tracks. We cooked together, drank wine, watched videos and chilled, with friends round to stop over most weekends. The odd car passing by on the lane to the fishing lake, that sparkled in the distance when the sun caught it, was the only interruption. You get the picture. It was a dream home, a sanctuary, as we developed our very different careers in our 20s. There was nothing sinister about the house, it was just light, fresh and warm. A tranquil and idyllic place. During the October, the weather changed as it normally does, bringing the remnants of the Atlantic storms round to the UK. I was working in the office in Newbury that afternoon and quite a storm had kicked up, with high winds and deep black clouds. My colleagues and I sat there working, while watching all sorts of debris blowing around outside the huge office windows, listening to this tall modern block creaking in the wind. Then the power failed and we were all sent home. The drive was 20 minutes, but as I drove there it was clear the power cut had affected the outlying villages too. There was no power at home, so we made plans while we still had daylight to find some candles, lay the fire and prepare some supper with a gas bottle stove. It was very cozy, and after spending the evening round the fire we decided to turn in early. Waking up on that Saturday morning was being in a different place. Wall-to-wall sunshine, no wind and the promise of a lovely but crisp weekend ahead. Another timeless weekend stretching ahead of us. I went downstairs to the kitchen to find the back door wide open, and leaves all over the floor, in some places piled up high into piles. My house shares denied leaving the door open. It was clearly locked from the inside, dark heavy black ironwork bolts. We had not opened the door all night, and I always check doors last thing. As I went to close the door I looked out, up the hill through the beech trees and saw movement. Lots of movement coming from the trees. I stepped out cautiously to get a better look, and plain as day several tall thick beech trunks were rippling. I was aware that my house share, let's call her Joanna, was by then standing next to me, jaw dropped and like me completely mesmerized. We watched as what I can only describe as armies of squirrels and undeterminable shapes were scampering down the sides of these trees. There must have been several hundred of the things. Squirrels and larger dark gray, diamond shapes, which we could not identify. It was weird, and they seemed to disappear when they got to the ground. I then nudged Joanna, because over to my right was a large fox, just sitting upright, in the morning sun, watching these things. Eventually all the animals dispersed, the scampering stopped, and we were in the still morning air once more. We set about clearing up the leaves in the kitchen. As we moved the leaves we saw tiny flashes of light, like the sort that a sparkler shoots out. Then we noticed mini tornadoes of leaves swirling round inside above the kitchen floor, about 4 to 5 feet high, a foot wide, just little swirling columns of a few leaves for 2 or 3 seconds, but no sound and no fear within us at all. Just really odd. Later that day and over the next 3 weeks a number of things happened. My father's dog, which had been missing for 2 years, returned home. Joanna's brother's progressive cancer had disappeared. My sister finally got pregnant, after nearly 7 years of trying. I picked up a call on the landline from an auction house. An old book collection Freddie had inherited, and had been getting valued, turned out to contain a rare edition, which he eventually sold, raising enough for half the price of his first house. He had been on the point of just giving the books away. Most of all, we continued to live in the lodge house for the remainder of the let, and are still close friends today. 2 of our children got married. The fox turned out to be a vixen and would lay under the beech trees with her cubs, about 20 feet from the kitchen door, none of which were wary of us. I stayed in touch with the couple who owned the house. The year they returned to reoccupy the house, they woke up one October morning to find the vixen curled up on a bed of leaves in the footwell outside the back door, having drifted off to sleep for the last time. I had a friend pass the summer we graduated high school. Shortly after her passing, I was laying in my driveway one evening looking up at the stars. I saw a white owl fly over, lived in California, US. The next morning, dawn, I was walking to a friend's house. Friend had been friends with late friend as well. There was no one in sight. An empty field was on my left and a park on my right. It sounded as if I heard my name in my late friend's voice. I continued walking and brushed it off, and thought I was just hearing things, as it was so early and no one was around. Then clear as day there was my name again. Stopped me dead in my tracks. Not a soul in sight. I got to my friend's house and told her what happened and told her of the white owl. She said she had seen a white owl the previous night as well. She said she had encounters since our friend passed as well. Another incident, I was at work and a co-worker and I were talking in the lunchroom and the water turned on all by itself. There isn't too much to that one, but I thought it was a little freaky. When I was about 9, my dad said he woke to my yelling for him to come upstairs, parents downstairs, kids upstairs. He said he came into the room, and I had my bedroom windows wide open sitting on the sill saying my sister was telling me to come out to join her. I have a memory of my sister in the street outside holding a balloon she'd gotten from a party, but she was in her bed. I did sleepwalk when I was young, but that was the one where I was in danger. My cousin's family have a story that they were away staying in a friend's big country house, and the adults were all having drinks in a room. My cousin, who was about 3 or 4 at the time, came into the room telling them that there was a lady asking her to come away with her. The story has been sitting in my mind all my life. Strange, all the child stories of being asked to come away with someone. When I was about 11 and my sister was 17, we were home, in our parents' end of terrace house. We were on our own and it was quiet, the house is on a quiet road. I remember we were standing on the landing and suddenly, we heard children's voices signing the line, "Ring a ring o' roses," and then it was quiet again. As it was end of terrace, in our room we could hear the TV from next door on and can still hear when the neighbor children cry, but it's always clearly through a wall, like it sounds muffled. This was as clear as day. It was silent and then the singing and then silent again. There were no kids playing outside or anything. The only thing I could ever think was that next door turned on a TV or radio and then almost immediately turned it off again, but like I say, it was so clear. Like it was next to us. My parents still live there and I still sleep in the room with the connecting wall to the other house when I stay, and I've never heard anything else like it in the 20 years since. I also teach in a school that dates to the Victorian times and come over summer. I was the only one in one of the buildings, and I heard children's footsteps running through the hall, but that was less convincing. Not long after my cat died I heard him purring as clear as anything. It was a great comfort. My ex and I also went to stay in a cottage in Herefordshire years ago, and I felt the entire time this suffocating feeling of dread, like I was being watched. I still did have a nice time, but especially in the quiet fields nearby and in the evening, I just felt as though something was there. I didn't sleep well and felt uneasy through the night. He felt the same, and he was absolutely not one to buy into that. We got back one evening and the gate we had locked was unlocked. Almost certainly, just the owner of the place popping by or something, but on top of the feeling of being watched, we just packed up and left a night early. Driving through the winding country lanes in the dark, I didn't feel at all safe until we pulled onto the nearest A road. I used to babysit 3 children who lived in a massive house. Think 4 huge floors with random corridors going off to other rooms, interlocking rooms, cellar. I used to sit in the kitchen snug where they lived and I used to have to steel myself to go and check on the sleeping kids. Up 3 staircases past a wall-to-floor mirror halfway up. I was terrified of accidentally looking in the mirror and seeing something. I would run up as fast as possible and down the same way before getting back to the cozy kitchen. Same if I needed to use the bathroom. Never saw anything, it was probably just my overactive imagination, but it felt creepy. Ghost Stories Part 3. Funnily enough, I believe I saw another one of my mum as a child. I was maybe 8 or so and woke up in the night to find the hall light on and my door wide open. Sat up feeling wide awake, as it was bright and I felt on edge for some reason. Looked back to see my mum had suddenly just appeared at the end of the hall. She walked down to her room and didn't turn off the light. Something was just so off. I called out a few times, no response, so I really started to call to them. I wanted to step off the bed, but I felt instinctively, do not do this. I called to them for maybe an hour with no response, becoming increasingly more fearful. And I was long past the age at night where I'd normally call to them unless there was severe issue. So they would have responded had they heard. I felt like that was not her I had seen. Seems like an odd thing to say as opposed to maybe they were just ignoring you, but I can't put into words the feeling of unease, of do not touch the floor I had. A cold feeling. A pure fear. The next day they said they never heard a thing. For all I know maybe they were just shagging, but still, they would have responded at some point as I grew hysterical surely. I wonder now if it was a doppelganger thing. Or if I was somehow out of my own timeline briefly. Even if she'd been sleepwalking or something, which might explain leaving the hall light on, he would have responded. Just an odd thing I've always remembered from childhood. We talk about it sometimes now. Rationally it's easily explainable, but it felt off. Like a waking dream. But I know I was awake, because I stayed up for a long time debating whether or not to step off the bed, pacing my bed, sitting on it, calling out. Me, my DS7 and baby recently stayed in a very old cottage on holiday. First night, just after 3 a.m. I hear footsteps, so prominent that I thought DS had woken up and was heading to our room. I opened the door, and he wasn't there, in fact he was still in bed. I went back to bed, the door gently opened ajar and then shut. Trying not to panic, I decided to dismiss it had happened and turned my back away from the door and went to sleep. The footsteps continued to happen the following nights at the same time, to the point where I opened the door, because I was sure someone was there. Last night, no footsteps, but the whole power went out. Restored 15 minutes later, the morning of departure, I have never been so eager to leave. Everything was shoved in cases, and I was practically dragging everyone outside. I then allowed myself to freak out, smiling face with open mouth and tightly closed eyes. DH decided to then tell me of the unexplained activity he saw too. Next holiday, we're staying at a Premier Inn. I am pretty open-minded and believe anything is possible, but it does make me laugh how so many stories of ghosts, demons, poltergeists, and ghouls are in really old, often large houses. And often in a remote or rural place. And they are nearly always Victorian or medieval ghosts. It's never a ghost with a One Direction t-shirt on, in a tiny 2013 new-built semi in the middle of Wolverhampton or Croydon. I have seen modern ones. But if I passed one in the supermarket, I wouldn't know, would I? Most houses on my street are 150 years plus old, and there are older things underground. A lot of streets in the UK are like this. It's a bit like cleaning. There is more ghost built up over time. Maybe. I guess there would be more chance of a ghost in older houses than there would in a 2013 house, as more people would have lived there. But it's just funny, to me, that people who claim to have seen a ghost nearly always say it's a house that's 100 plus years old, and it's always huge, and rambling with dozens of rooms, and sometimes multiple floors, and a cellar of course. And it's nearly always rural. It's never even 1960s, 1970s, or 1980s houses. And they would have had a good few people live in them, and people who had died since living there. Maybe it's reflecting Mumsnet users living more middle class, lives in Victorian semis, and so on. I saw a deceased family member in a 1970s build house, but mistook him for a guest having a quiet moment in a side room, till he disappeared. It was a rambling house though, sorry. It was confusing, because he looked familiar, but was someone I'd not met in his lifetime. I saw the ghost of Gloria Gaynor once. At first I was afraid, I was petrified. I've had lots of weird experiences, but one of them when I was a child about 10, and I got an old china doll as a gift. I collected little dolls and the others looked pretty, but this one creeped me out. I had them sitting on a shelf, but they were facing away from the position of my bed. Every morning I woke up and the creepy doll would be facing me, it had turned round. I kept putting it back, but each morning it was facing me. I thought maybe someone in the family might be pranking me. That was until one day I was in the room alone with it. I was looking at it and got such an uneasy feeling. I grabbed it, wrapped it in an old top, and turned it face down. I turned to leave my room when I heard a strange whooshing noise. I immediately turned back to look at the doll. It was unraveled from the top and glaring at me. I got rid of it that day. Still spooks me out when I think about it. Both of the odd houses that I lived in that had something were newer houses. The first was an early 1970s semi that had an oppressive feel about it. My parents had a carved stone ashtray, despite being non-smokers, on top of the television in the lounge. There would sometimes be a heavy smell of cigar smoke, and then ash would appear in the ashtray. No one smoked in our house, and we'd had no visitors, but the atmosphere would feel edgy and dark. I spent a lot of time outside of the house, because I hated it, but I would sometimes see a sort of dark vision, or impression that looked like a large man holding a cigar. The other was a 1990s semi. We'd only been moved in for a few months when I saw Ned for the first time. We had a long room on the ground floor that was a lounge at front and diner at the back, that stretched from front to back garden with sliding patio doors out to the garden, and the stairs were near the front door, open to the lounge end. One afternoon I walked down the stairs, and when I got to the bottom and turned towards the diner end as the kitchen was off the diner. Stood in the diner in front of the doors was a man dressed in a yellow fisherman's sou'wester-type coat with matching trousers. He was dripping wet and had the hood up hiding his face, but I felt overwhelming sadness from him. He just stood completely still, and I think that I said, "Oh, hello." I stared at him for a minute or so and looked away to check the time for 1 second. School pickup time was due, and when I looked at him again, he was gone, just vanished. I regularly saw him every few months under the exact same circumstances. It was always afternoons, and he was in the exact same spot looking the same. In the end I called him Ned. On afternoons when he appeared I would say, "Hello Ned, I wish you could find your peace," and I would gaze at him for a minute or so and then deliberately look away. When I looked back, he was always gone, leaving no trace of his having been there. I have told this story on MN before, and also told loads of people, so probably outing. Years ago I worked with adults with LD, in a unit that was opposite the site of an old psychiatric hospital. One day I was taking one of our residents for a walk in the old grounds opposite, and there was a figure in a long black hooded coat a few meters ahead of us. The resident I was with mainly non-verbal, but used to shout out random sounds. Every time he shouted, the figure ahead of us stopped for a few seconds, but kept facing forward. This happened about 5 or 6 times, then when it stopped it turned around to face us. Well, actually it didn't really have a face as such, it was like a sort of head, but had no features. It scared the bejesus out of me, so I grabbed the resident's hand and fled back to the unit. I honestly thought I had seen the Grim Reaper. I did not tell anyone back at work, because I thought they would book me into the mental health unit next door. The resident I was with would have been unable to communicate what we saw to back me up. Months later, when we were taking some residents on the same walk, a new member of staff said she wondered if there were ghosts around, because of all the patients who had died in the hospital. I only then felt brave enough to recount my story. Word soon got around back at the unit, and people were intrigued, rather than doubting me. A few days later a colleague said that she had started to tell the story to her daughter, who had worked at the physiatric hospital years before. When she got to the part of the figure turning around, her daughter interrupted and said, "I bet she didn't have a face." It turned out that the daughter had encountered the faceless figure about 10 years previously, but had also not told anyone, in case they thought she was imagining things. Name changed to post this, as spoken to several people IRL about a couple of things. I live in a post-war ex-council semi. Never had any bad feelings here, and I do get strange feelings in some houses. However, several years ago, I had a couple of days where I just felt off, like someone was watching me all the time. One of these days, when I was home alone, mid-morning, DS had left a remote control car on the coffee table, and I suddenly noticed the aerial on the controller bouncing from side to side, like someone had pinged it with their finger. I was sat watching it, trying to work out what could have caused it, when the car itself started up and shot forwards off the table and across the room. The next day, again, home alone, I heard this god-awful kind of static noise, so got up to see where it was coming from. DS's wireless amp in his bedroom had turned itself on and was making that horrid noise amps make when nothing is plugged into them. The switch on the back is a very solid rocker-type switch, and I could not get it to sit halfway, or anything, so couldn't work out how on earth it had switched on. The uneasy feeling lasted about another day, then everything felt normal again, and has done since. Another weird one was a couple of years ago, when I was sat at 11:37 a.m. having a cuppa, again completely alone, and I suddenly heard my mum's voice as clear as day saying, "Oh hi Jean." Mum has been dead since 2009, but it was unmistakably her voice. Jean was a good friend of my mum's and Jane had heard from her in a while. So I started Googling, only to find Jean had died recently and her funeral had started at 11:30 a.m. That freaked me out more than a bit. I'm going back about 17-18 years here. But someone bought my Didi a China doll that stood on a stand and was wearing a foul green lacy dress and bonnet, the type you'd win at bingo. I hated that doll, it had such an evil vibe. I swear her eyes used to follow me round her bedroom and I'd hear voices in my head if I got too close to her. Anyway, we were moving house, so the kids had gone off with their grandparents while my friend and I moved our stuff to the new house. It's rotten to admit, but that doll creeped me out so badly. I wrapped her in newspaper and dumped her in the old house bin. Got to our new house, unpacked most of our stuff, and left the few remaining boxes for the next morning. Woke up and there was that blasted doll next to Didi's bed. I tried to get rid of it over the next few years, but it always seemed to come back. My friend swore she hadn't fished her out of the bin, and she's known for being very honest. I'd sat with her in the van, and I would have seen it. A few years later, it just disappeared. Didi swears she didn't been it, was there when she went to school and gone when she got back. I'd been at college all day and her siblings at school, so nobody was at home all day. Can't say I was too upset about it. I've never felt such evil. That's a very creepy story. Got shivers and goosebumps all over my body. I think there may be something attached to them, or someone has put a spell. It can sound like crap, but I know exactly what happened to me was 100% real. Very spooky. I wonder where your creepy doll is now. When I said I got rid, I never binned mine, just gave it to a relative. I think of it now and then and it creeps MW out. These things are very real. There is an area near to me where the houses are very old. I once saw a man there, dressed in Napoleonic War uniform. I remember seeing him walking in a very purposeful way with an expression I can't quite describe. I was really fascinated as why he'd be dressed like that and where he was going. There was nothing going on nearby which could explain the uniform, and I remember thinking how authentic it looked. I then started to think maybe I was seeing a ghost. There was something about him which didn't add up when I thought about it logically. My grandparents and my mum and aunts moved to a house in a wood. Many times, at a certain time of day, a door would slam and footsteps would cross the floor, but nobody was there. They got used to it. In the house they lived in before that one, nothing unusual happened, but I recently was in touch with a lady on a Facebook local history page who lived in that house. She said all the time she and her family lived there, weird things happened like voices when nobody else was in, footsteps walking upstairs, but nobody was there and things going missing all the time. Whatever was there must have been attached to her family, as my family experienced nothing spooky there. Ghost Stories Part 4. A few things have happened to me. My halls of residence dated back to the 1800s and had originally been a boys' school. I remember one night having a very vivid dream of there being sealed up rooms in between rooms, and you were okay if you had a yellow ribbon tied to your door. For the record, I never did drugs or smoked anything. The next morning I said to a friend I'd had a really odd dream. She asked me what it was. Her face went white. She had had the exact same dream. Odd things would happen. I would hear heavy breathing coming from the other side of the room, heard footsteps walking across the room, and one time I heard a baby cry. I lasted one term in that room and moved to a different hall, as I just got such a bad feeling. Another occasion, I went into the common room and the TV was flicking itself on and off. I was the only one there. My nan's funeral was at 3 p.m. A friend of hers had traveled down for the funeral. She was talking about being late, because her watch battery had stopped working and had visited a jeweler for a new battery. We were at the wake and somebody asked her what the time was. She looked at her watch and it had stopped exactly on 3 p.m. This was a new battery. There are an awful lot of walled-in slivers of space in the UK. I moved around the furniture in a university room and started to hear knocking from the wardrobe. I checked behind the wardrobe and found a walled-in, painted-over doorway. Years ago, I took part in a Halloween walk or storytelling event. It was at a site that had previously had a large manor house, but that had been demolished 70 or so years ago. I was one of the storytellers, and had looked a little into who had lived in the house at the turn of the last century. I told my, completely made-up, story, naming one of the former lords of the manor. We then went out for a walk. As we were standing around, waiting for everyone to assemble after going to the toilet, etc., I felt a very distinct slap or cuff on the ear. Nobody standing near me, and I wasn't standing under a tree for anything to have fallen. I assume the lord of the manor took offensive at my story. Coming home from work late one evening, and missed my usual fast train. The one I got was all stops to my station where it terminated. It was old rolling stock with heavy latched doors between carriages. I was in the front carriage, seated just past the latched doors, facing the driver's carriage, solid, locked door, with the central doors ahead of my seat. As we moved from station to station, people got off, and I was aware of a man sitting at the bank of seats in front of me, just past the central doors. We approached the penultimate station, and I saw that he'd got up to stand by the doors. At no point was he facing me. Just looked like any other city commuter. The doors closed and we pulled away, and I glanced up to see him still there. I assumed he had stood up too early for his stop. As we got toward the terminus, I sent a text to my DH asking if he'd pick me up. I gathered up my things and got off at my stop. Then I realized I hadn't got off alongside anyone. I was the only person that stepped off from that carriage. I looked back, but the carriage was empty and there was nobody else on the platform behind me. After my cat died, I'd often feel her sitting on the bed, curled up beside me. Oh, I've got one. When I was about 10-11, I went to the local cinema with a friend. It was an old seafront building that had previously been a theatre before it was a cinema. It's now a theatre again. I went to the toilet during the movie, and was completely alone in the toilets which were up some stairs. I heard someone come up the stairs in heels and cross the toilet floor. You know the sort of 90s pumps I mean, the clicking sound is distinct. When I came out, no one was there. No one went in any of the other cubicles and there was no other access or exit to the toilet area. I even checked under the other cubicles. The footsteps went from one side of the toilets to the other and just disappeared. Freaked me right out, and I never went to the toilet in there by myself again. I wonder if they have redone the toilets when they remodeled. A few, and I'm not a very woo sort of person. But I know what I've seen. Was once walking my dog out in the sticks with a friend, and we saw the ruins of an old castle. I mean proper ruins, no roof etc. On our way back home, we saw a castle in the distance where the ruins had been and there were windows with lights on inside. It was a fully standing castle, as if it was lived in and very much alive. We found drawings of what the castle once looked like and it was as we saw it on the way home. It was like the ghost of the castle. Secondly, saw a woman in a red dress on my landing when I was a child and very much awake. Ran to my mum, asked if it was her, and she said no. NC as don't want linked to my other posts. My dad's parents both passed away in the family home that was left to my dad. They still live there now. I've had feelings of someone just sitting at the end of my bed before when I was living there. I think it was my nan looking over me. My room was their main bedroom, and where both grandparents passed away, my parents extended the house and took the new master bedroom. One Christmas me and my cousins, on my dad's side, were asking about what our grandparents were like as they died before we were born. Dad and Auntie chatting about them. Suddenly the TV turns on and on the DVD blue screen mode playing the song Holly in the Ivy, but the CD in there was Robbie Williams' greatest hits. Auntie shouted, "Hi Mum." Our grandparents were florists and grew flowers, etc. Another time at a family gathering, other side, the adults all wanted to try this thing they saw on the telly about someone sitting on a chair, and you try to lift them with just your fingers, but it's too heavy. You then do something and put your hands above their head, you can then lift them. Well, it bloody worked. They were all so shocked they pulled their hands away. The poor person came crashing down and the dining chair broke too. Never seen my granddad look so white. When my eldest cousin was born, the letter J perfectly formed in mushrooms on the field and disappears overnight. His name began with J. Another time, at my cousin's house, I was convinced her cuddly toys were all moving and dancing alive. Woke my cousin up and she could see it too. Went and got my bro and other cousin from the other room and they came in and laid down and could see it too. We all laid there watching. It's one of my fondest memories with my cousins. We now think it was actually cars driving past and headlights making shadows where the cuddle toys were resting on her wardrobe and perfectly came through the gap on the curtain. But it was such a surreal night, he. The four of us all laying there together. I'm very anti-woo and prefer to believe in hallucinations and tricks of the brain, but when my nan died, just before she passed, she told us there'd been a man in a green suit in her hospital ward. It somehow came up in conversation with one of the nurses and she said yes, she's heard that from several patients. They all say that they've seen this man in a green suit. My nan also said that Grandad had been there, sitting on her bed waiting for her. He died about 20 years previously. If you Google Neil Oliver and ghost stories, there are a few good ones. I'll try to be concise, but this one really caught my imagination, about a woman whose ghost was haunting people while she was still alive. This elderly lady was at a drinks party, with neighbors old and new, when she overheard someone ask a young couple how they liked their old cottage. They said it was lovely, but things were spoilt by the fact that a young woman, they described her and her clothing, often appeared in their sitting room in the evenings. She usually sat and wept, but sometimes stood against the chimney breast, in great distress, banging her head against the wall until blood ran down it. The elderly lady was aghast, because she had lived in that cottage during the war. That's why she earwigged the conversation, and had been deeply unhappy when, searching for a document, had found letters which proved her husband away fighting, had been having an affair with another woman. She had a baby and a toddler, and felt in the depths of despair, and remembered crying in the sitting room, and the specific incident, where she leaned on the chimney breast, and banged her head till it bled. So weird, but how else would you explain that? Neil O has quite a few well-attested stories. I recommend him. Just to agree with PPS, who say they're anti-woo. So am I, honestly. But we had poltergeist activity in our house for a while some years ago, and frankly, I know what I saw. I don't swallow any old rubbish, but some things are very hard to explain. I'm still a skeptic. I take some convincing, but I think the really stupid people are the ones who declare bombastically that it's all a load of rubbish. As someone said, whether ghosts exist is uncertain, but people definitely see them. In other words, people aren't necessarily lying when they describe a ghostly encounter. It's just a matter of whether the apparition has any objective existence. But many stories, especially when more than one person saw the ghost, are hard to explain. There's a lot more going on, I think, than science can explain at the moment. One day, as with electricity and other phenomena, possibly there'll be an explanation. I used to live in York, born and bred, but moved away when I met DP, to get away from my narc family. One night, I was in a pub called the Golden Fleece. It's known for being haunted. We'd walked in and decided to not bother with the first bar, as it was really crowded, but to walk down the corridor to the lower bar. My ex was in front of me, and I was walking down, when something grabbed the back of my top and threw me down the corridor. Nobody there when I picked myself up, and the staff didn't seem too surprised. Years earlier, I was in a cafe under the cafe building, and the one next to it used to be a police station. The cells were underneath at some point. They dug out the cells and found some skeletons, at least one, with a knife stuck in its ribs. This news had just hit the papers when I wandered in and got chatting to a waitress. I jokingly asked if it was haunted, and just as the waitress was about to answer, a set of keys came flying down the counter, almost hitting me. Nobody could have thrown them. There was nobody there. In 2009, my cousin sadly died of swine flu. Baby survived, she didn't. My dad phoned me after 1 a.m. that Saturday morning to let me know she had been in hospital over 2 weeks by then. Just after I got the call, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Both me and OH were in bed. When I got up, my cat was acting really strange and nervous. I'm certain my cousin was saying goodbye that night. She had never been to my house. I lived in with OH, and we were not big buddies. I hadn't seen her for a few years. I've had a few woo experiences. My great-grandma used to see things, and I've seen a few things myself. I'm in a new build, less than 2 years old. I've had a couple of woo experiences here. Someone shouted in my ear when I was in bed, not asleep. I'd not long been in bed, and I bolted so fast I nearly ended up falling down the stairs. Absolutely shit myself. My DS4 once asked why the man was there and then was gone, and my 1-year-old laughs and waves at empty spots in mid-air, like she's playing with someone. The estate is built on old farmland at the bottom of Pendle Hill. There are ruins of old farmhouses on the estate. Their foundations have been made into features. Neighbors have reported odd things too, some of them around these houses, voices, but no one to make them, that sort of thing. My granddad worked in Bank Hall Pit, and before that Hapton Valley, left weeks before the disaster, and he told me some stories. He's not woo at all, but there are some things that he could explain. One day he was in the pit with his apprentice, and saw a head torch coming towards him. Called out a couple of times. No answer. He was getting quite cross at this point. My granddad wasn't a miner, but the work he did could be dangerous, so it was restricted people in the area only, as the work carried a higher risk of explosion. The head torch kept bobbing towards him and kept coming, and then bobbed right past them. These were tiny narrow passageways. You had to go in single file. They bricked it, of course, and legged it. They didn't come across the light on their way back, and when the next person they saw swore no one else had come up before them. Another time, he was working with his apprentice and heard someone shout, "Get down," so he did, grabbing his apprentice and diving into the dirt. Just then some overhead cables snapped and basically crossed over each other at shoulder height. It would have decapitated them. No one else was down there. Oh God, saw a mention of Hull, Syke and Pendle, and knew I had to contribute. Another one from Burnley. I have seen some very strange things, most of which were around Townley Hall. I used to live near there and was walking up Todmorden Road, where it's walled on either side. A little fella was coming towards me with a Yorkshire Terrier. I nodded to him. Something seemed off. I turned around and he wasn't there. He'd gone. But there was nowhere to go. It was a stone wall. Ah. My mum and dad also saw a strange wolf-man creature crossing the road a bit further up, near the top Townley car park. It was kind of hunched, looked like a man-wolf. That whole area is very atmospheric. My grandma also swore she saw fairies in the woods behind Townley. I enjoyed the Uncanny TV program shown in October last year. There was one about someone who kept seeing a child running past her window. It turned out that part of the labyrinth of a local disused mine went under her house, and a young boy working in the mine had got lost in the pitch black many years ago. Ghost Stories Part 5. My family were good friends with the owner of Mitten Hall in the 70s. They spent a lot of time there after hours with the owner and his partner, and often stayed the night, usually taking their dogs along. One night as my granddad was coming back from his room, a young girl, about 13 or 14, walked up the stairs, across the mezzanine, and then carried on towards the rooms up there. He asked his friend who she was. His friend replied, "What do you mean? There's no one else here but us." Just as his friend replied, all 3 dogs started howling and then all stopped at the same time. I've heard other stories about Mitten Hall. We definitely live in an interesting place. I think Townley Hall was on most haunted. I had a paranormal experience once, but I am not certain whether I saw a ghost or whether it was any other spirit. I can't even say for certain whether something happened at all. A couple of years ago, my husband and I dreamt that there was a man in our bedroom. After speaking to my husband the next day, I feared that it wasn't a dream after all, and that there was someone indeed. I dreamt that we were lying in bed at night, and that a man stood at the door staring at me. In my dream, my husband was standing in the corner with a heavy candlelight waiting for an opportunity to hit it over the man. I was so petrified in my dream that I couldn't move or scream, and was desperate for my husband to do anything. My husband dreamt that we were lying in bed at night, and there was a man standing next to my side of the bed and was masturbating. He was chanting and muttering and then ejaculated over my body. He appeared to be in a trance state. My husband said that he tried to move and shout, but couldn't. He was petrified for some reasons and in despair that he couldn't protect me. A shiver ran down my spine the next morning when we learned that we had similar dreams. We hadn't seen any movies that could have triggered such a dream, and I couldn't shake of the feeling that there was a man in our room indeed. I couldn't say what the man looked like, but my husband said that he appeared to be Indian or indigenous. A couple of months passed and I met this man again. In real life. We went to a concert in a small venue in a town nearby. We were the first people to arrive, and had a drink at the bar that was attached to the venue. I suddenly felt being watched, and when I turned around, I saw a man, and a cold shiver run down my spine as I instantly knew that it was the man from my dream. I know it sounds strange as I didn't recall what he looked like, but I just knew it. He was mature. Maybe 50 years old and looked like an Indian or indigenous. Tan skin, long black hair, and leather clothes with tribes jewelry. It was a rock concert, so this wasn't unusual. He was just staring at me intensely, but for some reasons, I wasn't scared of him at all. It was more the opposite. He was emitting warmth and I perceived him as some kind of guardian angel. It didn't take long until he came over to us. He started a conversation with my husband and appeared very friendly. He kept looking at me discreetly, and I could feel that he was burning to speak to me. When my husband went to the toilet, the man talked to me. He asked my name, the meaning of it, and where I was from. He was very interested in me, but I don't think he was physically attracted to me. I thought he was a spiritual person who felt that we had a connection. The band came on and the venue got filled, but he kept observing me from the other side of the venue. I debated with myself whether I should ask him about the dream, but then the night went on and I lost sight of him. I never saw him again. My husband didn't recognize the man, and couldn't recall whether he resembled the one in his dream. I'm not sure what you would class this as. But this is my experience. I am a nurse. A few years back there was a patient who was end of life, and had been for a few weeks. I looked after them a few times. One night, I had a dream that I was looking after this patient, when they suddenly got up out of bed, sort of transformed back to how they looked before they became ill, then walked to the door and told me they were going now. My next shift I was saddened to find out that patient had died the same night I had that dream. It would have been interesting to find out the time of his death. In fact, I think that was a lovely dream. I had a friend who died and we had fallen out because of her behavior towards me. She came to me in a dream, but as a young woman, and she apologized for some of the things she said and did. She was a believer in the afterlife, and said she would come back and let me know. I guess that was her way of telling me. Your experience of the vanishing passenger on the train reminded me of an experience I had about 5 years ago. I was traveling on a tube train towards Heathrow from London after a night out. It was about 11:30 p.m., and the train carriage was gradually emptying at each station as we approached Heathrow. By the time we reached Hatton Cross Station, there was only me and one other passenger, a woman in her 30s, left in the carriage. I was sitting about halfway along the carriage, and she was sitting at the other end, about 10 meters away. As we approached Heathrow, I noticed her stand up and head towards the train door. As the train slowed, I also stood up and went towards the next door along from where she was, then noticed that she wasn't by the door anymore. I looked around the carriage, but couldn't see her anywhere. There was absolutely no one else in the carriage at all. This was before the train doors had opened. She had just vanished. 10 years ago, we moved into a gorgeous semi-detached Edwardian house in a large, quite run-down town. I was heavily pregnant at the time with our first baby. The first night we heard children running up and down the stairs. I commented that they were clearly living next door, and was annoyed how thin the walls were because it sounded like the children were in our house. Our neighbors were an elderly couple, and had no children. As my due date neared, I often heard the children running up and down the stairs. I also woke occasionally in the night, and heard my husband walking around the room, and was very annoyed, because I really needed my sleep at this point, except that then I realized he was next to me. Finally, I woke a few times with a figure at the end of the bed and once with someone pulling my duvet off. I was weirdly fine about all this. It calmed down hugely when I had the baby, although I still sometimes heard the children on the stairs, and a strange smell that emanated from the basement. I became really interested in the family that lived there during WW1, a large family that had originally come from Ireland. One of the sons died during the August of 1918, and I visited the war memorial in Park in my town to pay my respects, and I said how sad and sorry I was that it had to end that way for him. I often looked out of the windows in the front sitting room, original glass in original sash windows, thinking of his mum and wondering whether she'd got the telegram, sitting there watching the telegram boy walking up the path. I remember speaking out loud to her and saying how sorry I was and that I was glad I'd brought a new baby into the house. It all stopped in the end, but I often wonder about that time and whether it was sleep deprivation or hormones or some kind of haunting. I feel like I said out loud the things that mother and son needed to say or hear. I lived in a haunted house a few years ago. I saw shadows all the time, and always felt scared when I was on my own. I have been tapped on the head and poked in the back. Electric toys were always turning on by themselves, and once it even threw a toy across the room. One night, I had sleep paralysis and a demon climbed on top of me. It was horrific. I'm sure it wasn't my imagination, because we have moved a few times since then and nothing like that has ever happened anywhere else. I'm so grateful I will never have to go back there. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Before you go, please like, comment, and subscribe for more daily uploads.